In today's video, I'm going to make another sentient mushroom robot. And you did hear me right when I said another sentient mushroom robot, because this one isn't actually the first one I've ever made. Almost exactly 2 years ago, June 1st, 2024, I built my very first sentient mushroom robot, which also happened to be the very first TrashBot build on this channel. I'll leave a link to that video in the description and right here. So 2 years later, 30 bot builds, plus a bunch of other dioramas and other builds that I don't consider bot builds, we're right back to where we started, building a sentient mushroom robot from trash. Although I will say that that first mushroom bot I built was actually more like thrift store things versus trash. I've come a long way and now I use a lot more actual trash versus just thrift store finds, but when I was first starting out, I really didn't have much of a collection to build from, so everything came from thrift stores. Which, if you're looking to get into a hobby like this, definitely go hit up the thrift stores. They can be a great resource to find old broken toys and parts and bits that you can build things with. Okay, I should probably talk about what I'm actually building here now. What you just saw, the intro, was me building the main body just out of a bunch of caps and plastic lids. And now I'm working on the legs. I'm building the upper part of the leg now, sort of the thigh area. And I'm starting with a broken toy piece, and then this part that I'm working on now is half of a drywall anchor, and that's just to fill out the leg to make it a bit more round and also add some nice detail. For the knee joint, I'm going to take a small section of this pen, and since it's hollow, I'm going to roll up a small piece of EVA foam and fill it up just so I have a bit more surface area to glue to, and so it's a bit more sturdy. Then I'll glue on some googly eyes to cover up that EVA foam and to make it all look like one contained piece. I drill a hole through the center of it and then add a small pin, and this will help me connect to the upper leg and the lower leg. For the lower leg, I'm just going to use a piece of this broken toy here, cut it down to a more lower leg kind of shape, and then I'll fill it out with a few of these connector set pieces. That looks pretty good, so I drill a hole in the top of it and I can connect it to the pin that I added earlier. Now all I need is a foot, and so for that I'm going to steal the feet off of this posable figure model here, which is a 3D printed version of the original posable models that I used to use back in the day when I was first starting to bot build and didn't really know how to build from scratch, so I would build them on these posable models. The feet on their own are pretty good, but I'm going to add a few extra beads just to fill out the space and make them look a bit more custom. And just like that, I have one completed leg, and now all I have to do is build a second one to match, just for the left side instead of the right side. So we finished the legs and some of the main body, so now we just need the arms. For that, I'm starting with this large bead, which will become the shoulder joint. And again, I'm filling it with EVA foam just to fill out the space and make it easier to glue to. Then a few more googly eyes, because you can't have a project without googly eyes. Then for the upper arm, I'm going to use a piece of a broken plastic pen, and once again, I'm going to fill it with EVA foam. I'm going to set that aside and start working on the lower arm, and these are the components I'm working with. This is the container that this small little container of crazy glue comes in. I actually don't use crazy glue, but I love the containers and I've used them multiple times. Once I remove the label, all I have to do is chop off just the very top of it, because inside you can see there's this desiccant tablet. It's this compressed desiccant powder that absorbs water, and once the bottom is removed, I can pop it out pretty easy with a pen. I cut off this bottom section of the tube and then fill it with EVA foam. Then I can cap each end with a wooden bead and this part from a model kit. Most of the time the pins I use are paper clips that I cut up, and then I rough up the surface with a metal file so that the glue sticks better. I'm going to be building the hands from scratch for this bot, and for that I'll be using some styrene. The finger sections are 1/2 inch each, and they're both rounded on each end, but one is a bit more pointy to match the pointiness of a fingertip. I will glue the two parts together just with some normal super glue, And then to reinforce the joints and to add a bit of detail, I'm cutting out some small pieces of styrene to cover each side of the joint. This tool here I'm using is called a wax-tipped rhinestone pen. This little piece of styrene also adds some strength and extra detail. For the thumb, it's the exact same process, except the finger sections are 3/8 of an inch instead of 1/2 an inch. I tend to build my robot hands with 1 thumb and 3 main fingers, mostly because I like to save a little bit of time by not doing 5 fingers per hand, and also 3 fingers just looks a bit better at this scale. 4 fingers can look a bit too crowded sometimes. For this build, I just built the palm out of a block of scrap wood, but sometimes I can find pieces of scrap plastic or toy parts that fit the shape, and so I'll use those instead. This one I just couldn't quite find the right shape, so I built it from scratch. And just like that, we have one completed arm, and I just have to build the other one to match. And the hand that you're seeing now is actually the second iteration. Originally, I had built this one, which used 3 finger sections and a half wooden bead for the palm, but you can see it was just a bit too large, so I ended up having to remake it in a smaller scale. At this point, most of the parts of this robot are fully built. I just have to find a way to attach everything together, or at least build the attachment points so that I can attach them later after painting. For the legs, I was able to find this small section of aluminum tube that fits nicely into the legs that I already built, and I'll use a pin to help secure it to the main body, and then I'll add this plastic ring as a decorative cover. After everything is glued up, I do a quick test fit just to make sure everything fits, but I'll keep these separate for painting. Moving back to the upper body and arms, I want the shoulders to be attached to the inner section, so I cut out a circle using a template and my Dremel tool so that the shoulders are slightly inset, which I think just looks kind of cool. I also do the same thing to the bottom section, so I have a matching circle, and so it looks like sort of like armor or something instead of one solid piece. The shoulders of the arm will fit in like this, but I do add a small sort of spacer using a piece of tubing that will offset the arms slightly just so you can see everything a bit better. All of the robot parts of this build are complete, and now I can just put them on some paint sticks and send them outside for a coat of primer. And while that primer coat fully dries, I can start to build the key feature of this mushroom robot, and that is the mushroom. To sculpt my fungus, I'm going to be using Sculpting 3, which is a polymer clay that you bake in the oven to cure. I'm using the translucent color mostly because for whatever reason this color of Sculpting clay cures really nicely into a hard, almost plastic-like material compared to some of the other colors I've used which cure into more of a rubbery and sometimes even brittle plastic, so that's why I like using this translucent stuff. One of the cool things about polymer clay is you can use a heat gun to cure areas of it if you don't want to mess them up while you're working on other parts of it. For this one, you saw me use my heat gun to cure the gills on the underside of the mushroom so that they wouldn't get messed up while I was working on the top side. You just have to be a bit careful with this technique because that direct heat can cause some cracking if you expose it for too long. I'm definitely not as strong when it comes to sculpting organic shapes, but luckily mushrooms are relatively easy and simple shapes to sculpt, and I actually had a lot of fun making this one. Once I was happy enough with the shape, I can add it to this ceramic tile and I bake it for the recommended bake times. And here is the baked mushroom fresh out of the oven, and now I just need to seal it before I can start to paint everything. I use this super thin super glue as a sealant, and while I'm wearing gloves, I carefully cover all of the faces with the super glue, and because I'm constantly moving my fingers around and spreading out the glue, it cures into a protective clear coat. This not only adds some strength to the clay, but it also protects it from any weird reaction it may have with some paints. Polymer clay can sometimes react weird and make a sticky mess, so this just helps reduce those chances. It's time to add some paint to this model, so let's break out the airbrush and start painting. I'm doing 2 different tones of green for the main body, at least with my airbrush, 2 of these lighter greens, and then I'll use a darker green with some hand painting a bit later on. And while I have my airbrush out, I'll use some beige paint to paint a base coat on the mushroom, and then I'll do some hand painting to finish that one off. These are the colors I'm going to use for painting the mushroom. I really didn't have much of a plan going into this. I just started putting down colors in different washes and applications and just seeing how they looked. Because I know, worst case, if I didn't like how it looked, I can either wipe most of the paint off or just repaint it and start over. I also wasn't really working from any reference images. I was just using the mushroom image that was floating around in my head. You know, doesn't everyone have a mushroom image floating around in their head at all time? No? Just me? Oh. Well, anyways, I decided that my mushroom needed some eyes. So I made these out of some wooden beads, and for the pupils, I used a piece of a sprue from an old model kit. I mix up a small batch of 2-part epoxy putty, and then I use that to sculpt in a couple of eyelids. Then, once that's cured, I can use some sanding sticks to refine the shape. These were a bit difficult to sculpt just because they were so small and hard to hold on to, but I was able to get them to a decent point, and as you can see, they are quite expressive depending on which angle I angle them at, but I think I'm going to go with this to the side sort of VeggieTale Muppet look. They will get glued together and then primed and painted. And now that we are in the hand painting process, I think it's a great time to give a shout out to all my patrons over on my Patreon. Thank you all so very much for the support. Instead of decals, I want to add the Japanese word for fungus. I'm using fungus instead of, let's say, mushroom, only because the Japanese for fungus looks a lot cooler than the Japanese for mushroom. And I'm just trusting my translation app on this one as I don't know Japanese at all. I knew this painting would be difficult with a brush, so I'm just going to use a paint pen instead. Mechs and robots are very common in Japanese pop culture and art, and so this is sort of a reference to that. And personally, for me, some of the best cooked mushrooms I've ever had in my life came from a Japanese restaurant. Let's move on to weathering this robot, and for that I'm going to mix up some of this field gray and leather contrast paint into a wash. And I'm also going to add a bit of this jade green just to see what it looks like. This is sort of an experiment because the base colors are green, so I want to see what it looks like with a bit of green in the wash. The paint gets mixed with water and isopropyl alcohol, and then I will apply this wash over everything except for the mushroom, which has already been painted and is ready to go. The next step in weathering comes from this Tamiya Weathering Master Kit. I use a makeup sponge brush and apply the color on the robot focused on the raised areas and any of the sharp corners. Then to finish off the weathering process, I'm using this chipping pen and adding a few areas to make it look like the paint has chipped away and exposed the raw metal underneath. And as usual, I would love to open this bot up to interpretation. If you have a fun name, an idea for this bot, what it was meant to do, what it's currently doing, why it looks the way it looks, the story behind the bot, I would love to hear about it down in the comment section. In the past, you all have come up with some amazing stories and ideas for these guys, and I always love to read them. As I was gluing everything up, I did just realize that I forgot to paint the other spacer dark green, so that's a slight mess up on my side. Luckily, it's actually not too noticeable. This bot does need a base as it's a bit top heavy, so I make one off camera. In last week's build, the custom Hot Wheels video, I go into much more detail on how I make a base exactly like this, so check that out if you want to see. Thanks so much for sticking around till the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed. I think it's really cool that this video is going to drop almost exactly 2 years to the day from my very first custom bot build on this channel that also happened to be a mushroom bot. I honestly did not plan that at all and didn't even realize it until I was doing this voiceover. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, or cool stories about this robot, please do put them down in the comment section. I read every single comment and I try to respond if I can. In next week's video, we're changing things up. I'm making something I've never made before in my entire life. Don't worry, trash bots aren't going anywhere. We're just doing a little change of pace next week. So make sure you're subscribed to check that out. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video.